Hi, everyone. My name is Nadia Yakoob. I'm an attorney based in California who has been practicing for over 20 years. It's going to be 22. I started when I was 10, but really I've been practicing for over 2 decades, and I've actually been speaking for Rob's Idea to IPO meetup group for the last 8 years. And over these 8 years, I have enjoyed meeting so many savvy, entrepreneurial, largely tech investors and business folks. I've helped actually most recently an investor from the UK set up his cloud-based, he has this particular software he's created for me, as an alternative to AWS, for example. And so we got him his E2 investor visa, which I'll be talking about. I also have helped some Pakistanis, where I am from originally, get an an L1 visa, an intra-company transferee, another visa I'm going to talk about today. And I've gotten a lot of folks through this group O1s, which are visas for individuals of extraordinary ability. So I'll be covering that visa as well. And ironically, I've helped some of you with green cards based on marriage. So a nice variety of folks that I have been able to work with. And it's been so wonderful getting to know the members of this meetup group, Idea to IPO. As I mentioned, I've been practicing for over 20 years. I started my career at the world's largest immigration law firm called Fragaman, and I worked for their New York and Brussels and San Francisco offices for about 8 years. And then I decided I wanted to go into the government, so I worked for 5 years in the federal courts. There I reviewed final orders of deportation, worked with federal judges on decisions. And after 5 years there, because it's a 5-year term position, I returned to private practice and I decided to start my own firm so I can relate to all of you and your entrepreneurial instinct and your wish to start maybe your own company. But I know this is not everyone is necessarily an entrepreneur here. Many of you may be just interested in employment opportunities in the tech sphere in the US and specifically the Bay Area. So I'll definitely be speaking about those kinds of visas today. And so, for the last 8 years, I've had my own firm and I have watched companies grow literally from in the 5 years. One of my clients, I got him a green card based on extraordinary ability. Then he started his own company and I have watched him grow it from 5 people to now 1,400. So definitely possible. There's, especially in the Bay Area, the entrepreneurial ecosystem is so robust. There's a lot of support for creative and innovative thinkers and ideas and concepts. So I'm really glad that you have joined our presentation so we can give you some ideas on the different visa options available to you and how you can make that happen. So in terms of an overview, I'll start with just the visiting on a business visitor visa, right? So come to the US, see if this is where you want to actually set up, do your due diligence, maybe establish a network. There was a time pre-COVID when a lot of people where these presentations that I would give for Idea to IPO were in person. So a lot of participants were actually there on visitor visas, and they were doing their due diligence and meeting with potential business partners, investors, even checking out schools. So coming in on a visitor visa, we'll talk about, what it involves. And then I will talk about working as an international student. It's pretty brief discussion, but for those of you who are younger or maybe who are looking to study in the US, I'm going to definitely cover some of the advantages of doing that. I will then jump into all the temporary employment-based visas that are available and talking about the pros and cons, the strengths and weaknesses of each, and certainly touching upon how, depending on who's president, how the processes can work. Quick slide on ways to get a green card. That's permanent residence in the United States. So the majority of visas I'm going to be talking about are temporary. They allow you to come here and work. But certainly once you're here, you want to be thinking, if you're interested, in pathways to permanent residence. So I just sort of give you a quick overview of that, what that would look like. And then some common obstacles to getting your visa, especially at the US consulates. So just, the whole life cycle from start to finish. We'll just close with some of the things for you to think about. And then I can start answering all the questions in chat, and we'll definitely do my best to cover them all. But the program for today is an hour of my presentation. It's usually 50 minutes, and then I open it up to questions, and we usually go, the full 40 minutes or 50 minutes for questions and answers. Okay. All right. So first of all, coming in as a visitor, it's a B1 visa. You pick that up, you have to apply for it at the US consulate in your home country. You have to show that you have ties to your home country that would make sure you return. Okay. There's also the ESTA visa. Now the ESTA it's not really a visa, it's permission to travel to the United States without a visa if you're a national of a certain country. So there are about 40 odd countries where you don't need to pick up a visa. These are historically countries that have a low visa violation rate. So these are folks, they're from countries where they come and they actually go home. And so, it's like Canada, Australia, Japan, all of continental Europe. So these are the kinds of countries where you don't need to get a B1 visa. Now, the interesting thing about the ESTA is that it's only good for 90 days and you're not allowed to extend it. Whereas if you come in on the B1 visa, you're allowed to stay up to 6 months and you can extend it. So it may be that if you are, and this used to be a lot back in the day for Japanese nationals, they would these long travels to New York, they would want the B1 visa. They did not like the ESTA because they needed more time to explore their business opportunities. So certainly, even if you are an ESTA national, you can apply for a B1 if you just need more breathing room to come into the United States and explore your opportunities. Okay. Now you're not supposed to come here to look for work. People do all the time. But when you're coming through immigration or when you're applying for your visa, you certainly don't want to say that is your primary purpose of coming to the United States, because you're not supposed to be doing that. What you are supposed to be, what you could do is go to conferences, go to networking events, maybe take a short boot camp. So all of that is definitely possible on the visitor visa. Okay, so that is the B1 visa. There's also, just so you know, the B2, and that is to allow you to visit for leisure. So if you wanted to go to Disneyland or Yosemite, or go to a yoga retreat, certainly you can use the B2 and the ESTA if you're a national. Okay, so that's the B1 and the ESTA. Now, if you want to come to the United States and study, this is definitely a fantastic way to get the training, make the network, create the contacts to grow a business in the United States, right? Like if you wanted to do an MBA, or there are one-year master's programs that are phenomenal, or 18 months. And just as a side note, this is actually how my family came to the United States. My dad and his two brothers were international students from Pakistan in the 60s. And my one uncle got a job. He finished his degree at Berkeley, got a job at McDonnell Douglas, got a green card through his work, and then became a citizen and sponsored my dad, who got a job in Singapore after he finished his studies. And then my other uncle married an American, and who he met in college, and he got his green card that way and became a citizen. And the interesting thing is, if you have a brother or sister who has sponsored you for a green card, the wait is 13, 14 years, which it was for my dad. But by that time, he was married and had 3 kids, including me, and that's how we immigrated. So certainly coming in as a student, you can really build a life in the United States. So there are options for you to work while you're studying. One is called CPT, Curricular Practical Training. Another is optional practical training. This is granted to you when you are done with your studies, and it's for 1 year. And it's pretty flexible. You can volunteer, you can start your own company, you can be a freelancer. It's just 1 year. You're allowed to work here so long as you're working in your field of study. There is also a 2-year extension for those graduates of STEM fields, so science, technology, engineering, or math. So if you've come here and you've studied information systems, you did, let's say, a 1-year master's or 18-month master's in information systems, and then you got a job, you did your OPT, and then you can extend by another 2 years. So for 1 or 2 years of studies here, you just got 3 years of work authorization. So it really, it's a huge investment. It's very expensive to study in the United States, but it can pay off. When I say study, this is towards a degree or a certificate program. It's not to come study English. It's not to do vocational studies. Okay, vocational studies like chef, they give you very short amounts of work authorization after. But if you come to do a bachelor's or a master's or a PhD, these are the kinds of work authorizations that would be available to you. Okay. One thing to keep in mind is with CPT, there are schools that offer you CPT on day 1 of enrollment. You want to be very careful about the school that you sign up for with this. The US Homeland Security Agency, they created a fake school and they did a sting operation. So they created this fake school offering international students, oh, you register here, you'll get work authorization on day 1. And it was fake, and the students were like, sure, I'll do this. And they didn't plan on going to school. Well, all those students were arrested. So you want to be very careful that you're not just paying to a fake school to get the work authorization. Okay, so that's studying in the US, and that is the F1 visa. Now I'm going to jump into all the employment-based visas, so get ready. The first is the H-1B visas for high-skilled workers. By the way, I am going to send these slides to all of you participants after the presentation. So, don't worry if you're not able to catch everything. I'm certainly going to be sending these to you after, and we are recording this presentation as well. So the H-1B visa, which is the most popular visa, is for high-skilled workers, H-1B. And there are 4 primary requirements. The first is a bachelor's degree or the equivalent in professional work experience. So many folks don't finish school. We know Mark Zuckerberg, Bill Gates, right? And there's a lot of people who don't finish university, and that's okay, so long as you have, for every year of university you didn't complete, you have 3 years of work experience. So I've had clients where they have no college experience. They finished high school and went right to work, coding, doing software work. But then that means you need to show 12 years of work experience for every year of university you didn't complete. Okay, so that's the first requirement for the H-1B. In order to be highly skilled, the position must require a bachelor's degree or equivalent. So the most common H-1B roles are software engineers, financial analysts, operations research analysts, doctors, lawyers. These are the H-1B, the first requirement. The next is that you have to be hired by an employer, okay? So we'll talk about that in a later slide. If you wanted to start your own company, how could you sponsor yourself? The general rule is it's really not possible, but there are workarounds, and I'll talk about that in a follow-up slide. The third requirement is that you have to be paid the higher of either the actual or prevailing wage. I'll talk about this in a follow-up slide, because I know for a lot of you who may be wanting to go to work at a smaller startup, how can that startup pay you the right wage for the area and for the role? There are some workarounds, and we'll talk about that as well. And then the fourth element that is very important is the government filing fees. So in terms of budgeting, there are substantial government filing fees for the H-1B. This is the government's way of balancing the fact that there's no test of the labor market here, okay? An employer doesn't need to show the government, hey, I can't find a US worker for this role. None of that. But they do have to pay a lot of money to hire you, okay? And that's the way the government makes sure, hey, you really need this person. You're willing to pay all this money. And it has to be the employer who pays, okay? So let's go into each one. So the wage requirements, that's always a big one, because you have to make sure the employer sponsoring you, or if you're founding a company, right, with some other guy, let's say, I don't mean guys, but I'm just saying, if you're founding it with some other people, and you have to meet this prevailing wage salary. So what does that mean? You either need to be paid the prevailing wage. What is that? It is something the Department of Labor of the United States, they have a wage library online. I'm going to show you the next slide. It'll show you. It's an online wage library. You put in state, county, occupational category, you put in some keywords, it'll pop up some, and then you need to make sure you're paid at least level 1. Now, if you're going to go work for Amazon or Apple or Google, some big fancy company, they have to pay you the same that they are paying their workers. So a lot of the tech companies right now, I know things are quite dicey, but those large tech companies, they pay way above market. They always pay much more than the prevailing wage. That doesn't mean they can pay you as a foreign national less, okay? So you're either going to be paid the higher of the actual wage or prevailing wage, okay? And this is based on area that you're going to work and the job role. So it's based on occupation and where you are based, and in terms of level. So, they're not going to compare you to someone who's very senior and been there 10 years. They're looking at people in your level and in your area and in your occupation. Okay, so here's an example, if you can see, of what the prevailing wage looks like. This was from last year, but I put in area. You can see San Francisco. And I put in software developers, and here you can see a level 1 wage is right around 99,000. That's level 1 entry level. That's how much you have to be paid. Okay. Now, if you're going to go work at a smaller company that's like, there's no way I can pay you 99,000, then you can look at this hourly wage, and you could maybe work for them 30 hours a week instead of full time, because that is allowed on the H-1B. You are allowed to work part-time, so 20 hours or above. So you could say, look, I'll work for you 32 hours a week. A common question I get is, hey, what about equity? What about bonuses? What if I'm guaranteed a bonus? That does not count for the government. The government wants to know you are going to be paid, guaranteed this salary for your role, okay? So that is a very important requirement for the H-1B. It's the prevailing wage. Now, the next element is that there has to be an employer-employee relationship. So you can't be a freelancer, right? You can't be an independent contractor. That's the same thing. Now, you also cannot technically be, with a temp agency or a placement agency. The government hates those. But there are certain placement agencies that specialize in particular industries like pharma or, HR roles. And those have been successful in getting the H-1Bs. The reason is the government really wants to make sure that there's an employer who needs you. So if that is unclear because you're going to go work at a temp agency, the government does push back, and there'll be RFEs, and it could be RFEs are requests for more information, and there could be pushback, and there could be a denial, and you could get scrutiny at the consulates too. So those situations, you know, there's a lot of them offering to get you a job. They'll take your money. They make you pay for everything. You want to be very careful about those companies. Okay. Now, insofar, for those of you who are interested in starting your own business, technically, if you're self-employed, the H is not available to you. But if you have, let's say, you know, a couple of co-founders, you guys want to get together, and you want to start a company together, that is possible so long as you are not the majority shareholder. Okay, you have to show there's a board, and that, let's say you have 30% interest and the other founders have 70, or the other founder has 40, and then the board, you know, you have a stock pool, basically a pool of options available to investors. So we just have to show that you aren't the majority owner of the company. And the reason for that is, again, we have to show you aren't employee. So you can be a founder, you could be a part owner of a company, but you can't be the only owner, and you can't be a majority shareholder. Okay, so that's the H-1B. Here, I've just listed some traditional kind of, you can certainly be employed and work remotely in today's world. That's totally normal. You can work remotely, go hybrid model, all of that's okay. It's okay if you're not working at an office. It's okay if you work at a client site. That's all okay on the H-1B for purposes of, you know, that employer-employee relationship. Okay. Like I have mentioned, the filing fees are substantial for the H-1B, and the employer must pay. It's on the forms. They sign that they didn't take any money from the H-1B beneficiary for this filing. Now, do people do it? Yes, all the time. I don't recommend going this way. I mean, this is definitely not how you want to start your immigration story in the United States, but it is something that employers sometimes expect, and some foreign nationals are willing to do this. But again, they're signing on the forms that they did not accept any money. And what are these filing fees? And I want to bring these up because they can be shocking in how much they are. You pretty much want to budget around anywhere between $2,500 to $5,000 in government filing fees. Okay, this doesn't include the lawyer's fees. Most companies need a lawyer to help them prepare and file the H-1B. It involves a number of forms and applications. So those fees also cannot be paid for by you. They have to be paid for by the employer. And so you can see there's a base fee of $460. There's another fee of $500, and that's funds the fraud investigations. Then there's a fee of $750 or $1,500, depending on the size of the employer. So if you have less than 26 employees, that extra fee is $750, and then if not, it's $1,500. So these funds, if you're just curious, like, why are they charging me all these fees? This is money for the American Competitiveness and Workforce Act. So it's basically a training fund for Americans, so that they can get, you know, resources can be put into our education system so that we don't have to hire from overseas. And then finally, there is this fee, it's optional, of $2,500 if you want a decision in 15 calendar days. If you're like, you know what, peace of mind is priceless, I don't want to wait 3-4 months because that's the average processing time, you can pay an extra $2,500 and get a decision in 15 calendar days. Okay, so that's premium. Now, the problem with the H-1B visa, you know, after all these requirements, finding an employer who'll pay you the wage, you know, making sure that there's an employer-employee relationship, paying the fees, right? You've interviewed with folks, or you've thought about starting a company, you've done all this, but the big issue is that we have an annual limit to the number of H-1B visas that are available. And that number is ridiculously small, and I'll go over that in a minute. But what it means is we have an annual lottery for the H-1B visas, and it's in March, okay? And it's in a 2-week window. They announce it in January or February when that 2-week window in March will be. And basically your employer, it's not you, your employer sets up an account with USCIS, okay, by March 1. Then they register you during the 2-week period, okay, on its website. It's a $10 government filing fee, and a lawyer generally will prepare it just in order to make sure that you would satisfy the requirements for the H-1B if you were selected, okay? And then at the end of the month, the government runs a random lottery and pulls out the numbers I'm going to tell you. There's about 65,000, okay? And then extra 20,000. I'm going to explain. In total, it's about 80,000 they'll pull out registrations, and they'll let the employer know. If your registration was selected, they have 90 days in which to file the petition. And then once you're approved, you can start on October 1. So again, we're talking like 7 months of planning. So you have to also, it's not something that can just happen any time of the year. It requires a lot of planning. And that's why generally the H is for international students. They're here, they've got their network, they've found an employer who will register them, and then they're here so that they're ready to start in October. That's not to say, I've also seen now, with all these web platforms with freelancing, like Upwork and other websites where you can get these fantastic freelancers. I have seen companies have that relationship with a developer, freelancer. For example, in Ukraine, before the war, especially, a lot of Ukrainians were freelancing developers, or in Brazil, and then they would ask, hey, could you register me in the lottery in March? So that's another way I'm seeing now the relationships are being built such that you can ask a US employer to register you, okay? Now, just to tell you about this lottery and just the numbers, there are 65,000 given per year. And of these, 6,800 are for nationals of Singapore and Chile. I haven't had a chance to go through everybody who's come in, but if you're from Singapore or Chile, you don't have to worry about this annual lottery because you have H-1B visas dedicated just for you. Then if you do a US master's, there's an extra 20,000 H-1B visas. So what I find is that my US master's degree holders, those foreign nationals, have about a 40% chance of being selected, whereas anything else, it's like 25, 27%. And last year, just to give you some numbers, because at least in America, we love our data, we love our numbers. Last year, there were about 340,000 registrations. So you can do the math, right? 80,000 visas are available, and 340,000. Every year it's been over 300,000 registrations are received. Again, that registration belongs to the employer, not to you. So if they don't act on that registration after it's been selected, there's nothing you can do. So you want to make sure they file it for you, and you want to make sure you start with them on October 1. Once you're here, you can change employers, but you got to start with them. Now, some organizations don't have to worry about this. They don't have to worry about the annual lottery because they are research organizations that are nonprofit. So hospitals, universities, certain research organizations, again, that are nonprofit, don't have to worry about the lottery. So if you're going to come work at Berkeley, you could get an H-1B and you don't have to worry about the lottery. And again, as I was saying, you got to start with them. But once you're here, if you want to change employers, you need to extend your H-1B, you need to amend it. None of this needs to go through the lottery. In fact, for a lot of folks who've been let go, who are here in the United States, who are on an H-1B visa, you may have been seeing the news, a lot of them at Facebook, Twitter, Amazon, they've been let go. They've been part of these downsizings. They're often worried, oh gosh, am I going to have to go through the lottery again? No, if you have time remaining on your H-1B, and I'll explain that in a minute, you can still come back and use that time. Okay, so what does that mean? Let me share with you. How much can they work, right? So you can work full-time or part-time, as I explained in the slide on the wage, and you can hold multiple H-1Bs. So I've had clients who are working one employer part-time and another full-time. So that's possible. But you have to have the H-1B for the employer. So what you cannot do is come in on the H-1B and then start driving an Uber. You could, well, it's a gray zone. You could in the evenings and on the weekends, but you have to do the work that you were sponsored for, and you have to work for that employer. Okay, so you can't switch jobs without getting a new H-1B with that employer, but you don't have to go through the lottery. And so you can, again, you cannot work for someone else without authorization. Now, when we were talking about, okay, if you're laid off, what about the H-1B that you have? So you get 6-year maximum in H-1B time, and it's given to you in 3-year increments. So 3 years, and then you extend for another 3 years. If you have been laid off and you only use 2 years of the 6 years, you have 4 more years available to you that you can use in the future with another employer. So you don't have to go through the lottery again. Now, let's say, you're here, there's this 6-year limit. What happens next? Well, you want to make sure your employer is sponsoring you for a green card by about year 3 or 4. Okay, you want to make sure you have an employer who's doing that for you, because then you can get extensions beyond the 6 years if you're being sponsored for a green card. About your family, if you have a spouse and children and you want to bring them to the United States with you, they certainly can come. The child has to be under 21. The problem for spouses is they cannot work. The US is expensive. You want 2 incomes. Oftentimes high-skilled workers marry other high-skilled workers. So this is unfortunate for the spouse. But what I have found is these spouses often either they start studying and they build their own network, and then they get registered for the lottery. Okay, so definitely if they start studying, that is a good way of using their time and investing in their future. Okay, so that's the H-1B about duration and dependence. All right, I'm gonna move on to the next visa. I really like this visa. It's the L1 visa for intracompany transferees. I like it because there's no lottery. I like it because it's for international companies. And I like that it supports global mobility, right? It originates from the trade agreements by the WTO. And what it's for is if you are working at a company overseas, okay, you can be transferred to the US, to a US entity that is related after working for 1 year abroad, okay? So a very common scenario in the US that I keep seeing are these F1 students. They graduate, they have their OPT, they have their STEM OPT, and they're not selected in the lottery, even after 3 tries, 3 years, 3 lotteries, not selected. So what was happening is a lot of these companies would send them to Canada or London or Australia into their international offices. They would work, and then after at least a year, they would come back to the United States. Now, you can't just come back in any capacity. You have to be coming to work as an executive, manager, or a worker with specialized knowledge, okay? Generally, for the specialized knowledge worker, 1 year of employment isn't really considered enough because they say, how can you acquire specialized knowledge of the company in just 1 year? And the other thing is it can also be used, the L, which I love, and I've done a lot of these, is, let's say you are working for a company overseas, you're in, in Pakistan, for example, or India, and you want to bring your business to the United States. You can open a new office in the United States that is legally related to your company overseas, and then you can transfer yourself to be the manager of that company, to say, I want to grow my business, and I want to grow our family business, and I'm opening a US office. Now, the overseas operations needs to be of a critical mass. It can't be just a business of 4 people, and then you're saying, I want to go to the US. That's not going to make sense, okay? But if you are, I just did one for a company in India. They have about 200 people, and they have a very small office in the US, and we are starting to transfer their specialized knowledge workers. We're transferring a manager. So we're starting that, right? It's not a new office, but it's their first few, because they have a very small operation here. I'm also doing one for a gaming company out of Korea, and they've got their whole development arm in Korea. All the designers of the video games are there, and they have an extremely small operation in California, but this is where a lot of the funding is, right? So they have a small operation here, but they want to grow developers here. So they're sending over a manager here to start growing the designer department here. So that's the L. It's a fantastic visa. It does get a lot of scrutiny. The government pushes back a lot on these, but it's still, again, no lottery. The fees are not crazy. It's more flexible, and the great news is that your spouse gets to work. So that's a bonus. And especially for those who have these small, these family businesses that are not small, but, you could have 40, 50 people. I've actually helped one person through idea to IPO who is from Pakistan, who had a 40-person software solution. I'm not going to say exactly what it was, but it's a software solution that he had built. He had a computer science degree from the US, went back to Pakistan, built this product, and then had 40 people working in Pakistan for him. And then he wanted to come back to the US. So he came here on the L1, and he came with his wife, and his wife has the employment authorization, and she works with him. So it's a great visa that way. As I mentioned, the fees aren't as substantial. It's about $1,000 if you want a decision quickly, which I recommend, because the government takes 4 to 5 months to review these, and maybe you just, from business planning perspective, that's like too long to wait. So you can just pay the extra $2,500 to get a decision in 15 days. There are time limits. There's 5 years if you are coming as a specialized knowledge worker, and then there's 7 years for executives and managers. And for executives and managers, the great news is there's a green card, especially for executives and managers. So what a lot of my clients who are in this situation do is then they move to the green card. Okay. So that's the L1 visa. And some things sorry. So the green card is definitely a pathway to permanent residence from the L, which is fantastic. This visa, I just want to throw out there for my younger client, the younger participants on today's discussion, and that's the J1 visa for trainees and interns, okay? You can't do an unpaid internship here necessarily, but you could come for 12 months or 18 months. So if you haven't, if you have already studied in your home country and don't want to study in the US, then you could come here to do an internship. Or you could come here to do a traineeship after you graduate and have been working in your field. The one wrinkle with this is that it's short, 12 to 18 months. It can't be extended. And depending on where you're from, in terms of country of origin and where and the field that you're going to be training in, you could be subject to a 2-year home residency requirement. So not only is it a short experience, it could force you to stay in your home country for 2 years before you can apply for a different kind of visa to the United States. It doesn't mean you can't travel to the US. You can certainly come as a visitor. There are certain visas that are available to you, like the O1, which I'm going to talk about in a minute. It's for individuals of extraordinary ability. But just, if you're someone who's thinking, well, I want to intern at a startup just to get that experience, or I want to train at a startup, I'll go for the J1. I already have my master's from Switzerland. I don't want to get another degree. That's expensive. I don't want to start a company, but I definitely want to get the experience. This is a great visa for you. Okay. So that's the J1. So I keep jumping ahead to some other things I want to discuss. So I'll bring up the fact that I record podcasts on immigration visas. And I'm doing one on the J1 with one of my clients. So there's a podcast coming out on the J1 too. All right. This visa is another really fun one. It's the e-visa for treaty traders and investors. It does require that you be a national of a treaty country. Okay, so the first thing you want to do if you're on the computer is just look up e-treaty countries, State Department, and there's going to be a list of countries. It's on this hyperlink. So when I send you the presentation, you'll definitely have, you can look up the list, but it's about, let's say 60, 70 countries. Not all countries have it. The BRIC countries, Brazil, Russia, India, China, they do not have a treaty with the United States. Iran used to have a treaty, but that has been suspended. But if your country has a treaty with the United States, then you can come to the United States as an investor, so long as you own at least 50% or more of that country. Now, I always recommend 51 to avoid any questioning, but the regulations certainly allow for joint ventures. So you could do 50-50 with, let's say, someone in the US. So if you have a colleague or a friend or someone in the US who you say, I want to start a business with this person, you could do a 50-50 joint venture, but you need to be investing in it. Okay. And the investment must be substantial and for a real operating enterprise. So this language down at the bottom is straight from the regulations. And then, of course, my job as the lawyer is to explain to you, what do those terms mean? Let me start with the real and operating enterprise. It means it has to be a business that is generating jobs. There's no number required of jobs. But it can't be, okay, I'm buying an apartment in San Francisco and I want to oversee it. That's not an investment for the E2. Okay, this is the e-visa. There's E1 and E2. E1 is for trade. So that's in goods. So if you are trading in, let's say, towels or spices or textiles or rugs or cars even, you can do the E1. But the E2 is the more common one. And that's where you make an investment that is substantial. And it has to be for a real and operating enterprise. So going back to the question of what is a real and operating enterprise, well, it can't be, as I had said, a property. It can't be, oh, I'm going to play on the stock market. I've got $200,000 my grandma left me. She passed away and left me this money, and I want to play on the, New York Stock Exchange. That's not going to count. But if you said to me, hey, I want to buy a gelato shop in San Diego, or hey, I want to open up a sushi restaurant in the Bay Area, or a Pakistani restaurant, all of these have been my clients. So, or it doesn't even need to be a restaurant or shop. I've had clients start a law firm. I've had clients just with a film studio. I've had clients start, this cloud computing software that he's created. So long as we can show that it's a real and operating enterprise, you have an office space, you've got a business plan, you got money in the bank, you plan on hiring in the US, that shows it's a real business. Now, the next question I always get is, well, how much money? How much do I need to invest? I would say you want to invest at least 100,000 US dollars. You don't need to spend it all, but it needs to be transferred over to the US bank account. So you need a bank account in the US, and you need to wire over at least 100,000 to show, hey, here's my seed money, and here's what I'm going to be, this is how I'm going to be spending it. These are the expenses normally associated with my with this business that I want to start, and here's how I'm spending the money, right? And it could even be legal fees. It can be like, I've hired a web designer, I've hired a bookkeeper part-time, all these things. You can say, I've done all this to set up this business, or insurance, etc. So that's the E2. You usually apply for it at the US consulate. They do take about 6 to 8 weeks to review the materials, and then they call you in for an interview. They could ask you a few questions. They don't make a decision often right at the interview. I just had a client apply in Pakistan, and they asked him for some more information, which we'd already provided. And now they're just taking their time. But I had another client just apply in London, and it was approved right away. And another client applied in Toronto for his film studio in LA, and he was approved on the spot. So some consulates can take longer after the interview, and some consulates, after they've had their 6 to 8 weeks of review, they will approve you on the spot. The other good news is that these don't have a limit, an outer limit, in terms of how much time you can spend in the United States, but it's in 2-year increments. Okay, so every time you come in on your e-visa, you'll be given 2 years. And then you have to renew the visa every 5 years. Generally, some countries it's shorter. But you can renew for 15, 20 years and say, we've got this business, it's still growing, we're growing, we want to keep investing in it. So this is a great visa that way. And it also allows for your spouse to work. So that's fantastic. Okay. This visa is one of my favorites. It's the O1 visa for individuals of extraordinary ability. I've gotten a lot of O1s from folks I've met through Idea to IPO. The O1 is for individuals who have national or international expertise and recognition in the sciences, the arts, the education, business, or athletics, okay? And you have to be coming to the US to continue working in that area of extraordinary ability. It is tied to an employer or an agent. So if you're coming to work in the arts or athletics, you're going to have an agent generally, so that there's the agents route. Or, I was doing one for a cartoonist, and he had an agent. So the agent will say, these are all the different projects this person is going to work on. And then if you're coming to work in, just sciences, business, you're going to have an employer sponsor you. The interesting thing about the O1 is you could actually create that company and sponsor yourself. Okay. So it could be, this is one where you don't have to worry about majority shareholder interest. You could own it and you can sponsor yourself. You have to show, of course, that you have money to pay yourself. You have to show that there's work that you need to do. But certainly the O is one where you can start your own company and sponsor yourself. It's good for 3 years at the first, and then you have to renew it every year. Most of my clients don't end up renewing it every year because they apply for the green card based on extraordinary ability. So it's not a guarantee that you'll get the green card if you have the O1, but many of my clients end up getting the green card based on extraordinary ability. The unfortunate piece with the O is that your spouse does not get work authorization. So that's a bit of a drawback to the O visa. Now, what makes you extraordinary under the US regulations? There are 8 criteria and you need to show 3. So they are here listed: national or international awards in your field, published material about you or your work, I want to say on this point, there are PR agencies that you can hire. If you've got a product you're launching, if you've got a company and you want more press coverage, it's win-win, right? You can pay for a PR firm to publish about you, and then you've just gained evidence for the O1. Scholarly articles that you've published, USCIS, which is the Citizenship and Immigration Services, they go straight to Google Scholar. So if you don't have a Google Scholar page set up yet, you want to do that. They'll go there, they'll go look at how many sites you've gotten, they'll look at your publication history. So definitely scholarly publications is one. Being asked to judge the work of others in your field. So, in this industry, if you've been asked to speak at hackathons or startup pitches or whatnot, that could count as being asked to judge the work of others in your field. For my more academic clients, if you've reviewed journal articles, that's an example of being asked to judge the work of others. Membership in associations that require outstanding achievement. So we need to show that you're a member of an association that was selective. The next is important and original contributions. Now, this one is interesting because in the 20 years that I've been practicing, it used to be if there was a patent application, that was enough. Now, even if your patent has been granted, that's not considered enough. So now they want to see that the patent's having an impact on the industry. So it's definitely gotten tighter, this requirement. What basically the government wants to see is not that you're a great employee, but that your contributions are having an impact outside of just your employer and are having an impact on the industry. Okay, and then that you're receiving a high salary compared to others in the field. And sorry, let me just go back. And the last one, sorry. And the last one is employment in a critical role for an established organization. So these are the 8 criteria. We have to show at least 3. We often will get expert letters to supplement the evidence that we would be presenting. It used to be the more expert letters you could get, the more, more persuasive your petition was, but that's changed. The agency's definitely giving less and less consideration to expert letters, especially where that expert knows you. So, that's just one thing that we do, though. We do include a couple of letters. And if some of these criteria don't apply to your field, well, we'll say that this is comparable evidence. One is speaking at conferences. The government's like, that's not an evidence of extraordinary ability. But we say, well, they were invited to speak at this conference, and it's because they're considered an expert in their field. So that's the O1. Really fun. I love doing these. So that's, let me just make sure. Okay, so this category that we're going to cover now are visas for specific nationals. Just as an overview, there's only 5 citizenships that we give special visas to. The first is for Australians. They have an E3 visa, and this is for just like the H-1B visa. It's exactly like the H-1B, but it's the E3, and it's for Australians. So they also have an annual limit. It's just never used up. It's 10,500. They have to be working in a high-skilled worker position. They have to have they have to meet the prevailing wage requirement. And you can't be the majority owner of a company. So again, you could be a co-founder, you could be one of the senior people setting up the company, but you can't be a controlling shareholder. It's valid for 2 years, and it can be renewed indefinitely. So this is better than the H in that there's no 6-year limit, or the L, which has a 5 and 7 year limit. This is good, indefinitely. And your spouse can work. Okay, so that's a real bonus of the E. The next is the TN. It's for Canadians and Mexicans. So this is a visa. It's not as flexible as the H and the E. It's from a schedule of occupations. So you can look up, there's a schedule of occupations for TNs, and you have to be coming to work in one of those. Now, the interesting thing for my tech professionals is that engineer, computer systems analyst, those are in there. So I can get, my Canadian and Mexican clients in on the TN. There used to be a time when a lot of financial analysts were coming in as economists, getting a little scrutiny there. Often I'll just put them in as accountants. So there are, you have to make sure that your role fits within that occupation. There is no prevailing wage requirement, so that's good. But again, you need to be an employee. So if you want to start a company in the US and you're Canadian or Mexican, you cannot use the TN if you're the controlling shareholder, but you could use the E because the E2 is available to Canadians and Mexicans. There's no time limit on the TN, so there's no 6-year limit like for the H. You come in 3-year increments and you can renew indefinitely, but your spouse is not allowed to work. So that's the bummer here. And then the last two nationalities that benefit from special visas are Chileans and Singaporeans. Again, it's exactly like the H-1B, but it's called the H-1B1 for Chileans and Singaporeans. All the same requirements apply. The only disadvantage, I think, is that it's only valid in 1-year increments. And so you just have to be renewing every year, which is a pain. And the spouses are not eligible for employment authorization. One also minor drawback with the H-1B1 is that you cannot go for a green card from this category. And while the same rule applies for TNs and E3s, because they're given in 3-year increments, we have a little more flexibility. But with the H-1B1, with these annual renewals, it's very hard practically and legally to get a green card from the H-1B1. So generally, my clients who are Chilean or Singaporeans and are interested in the green card, we go for the H-1B for them. Okay. Now, I want to tell you about this program, the International Entrepreneur Parole Program. It was created by the Obama administration. It was put on hold by the Trump administration, and the Biden administration has revived it. But the problem with this program is that very few people have applied. We have very little understanding of what makes it successful, because we've heard of very few approvals, and largely that's because the government is taking forever to approve these. So it's very hard to understand, in terms of planning for, as a business person, you cannot plan with this IEP option. And so most lawyers just say, this would be like your last case option. If you can meet the requirements for this, go for the O, go for the E. It's not this one. It's mostly because we do not have visibility on how long the government's taking to approve these. We do know that they take at least about a year. So that is unfortunate. Okay, so let's look here. What are the qualifying criteria? It's got to be a business established under 5 years. I am so sorry. I'm going to need to just plug in my laptop. The battery is dying. Give me 1 second and I'll be right back. Hi, everyone. I'm back. Okay. Sorry about that. And so let me just go over the criteria for the International Entrepreneur Parole Program. You have to have established the business within 5 years before the application for parole. You have to hold at least a 10% ownership interest in the business. You have to play an active and central role in the operations, and you have to show proof of funding. The proof of funding is the interesting piece because the startup must have received a capital investment of at least $250,000, and it has to be from qualified US investors. It cannot be your family. It cannot be a crowdfunding. If you wanted to do something on the internet and say, I have this idea and, crowdfunding, or you cannot do that. It has to be a qualified investor. And there's a very specific definition of that qualified investor. It's here in the sidebar. You must have made one or more investments in at least 3 different calendar years in the preceding 5 years, totaling 600,000. So basically, there was a lot of back and forth with the government on this, as in the US, when the government is proposing regulations, it will invite the public to comment. And this was one area where a lot of lawyers who represent investors or who represent entrepreneurs, there were comments that, what are these like really strict requirements around who qualifies as an investor? And the government's response was, they're not really good at determining whether a business is viable. And so they actually, if an investor is putting all this money in, for them, that lets them know, okay, it's a real business. These are government bureaucrats. They're not MBAs. So this is one way for them to vet that a startup is viable. Now, if you're a startup that's focusing on the nonprofit sector, if you've received 100,000 in grants and awards from qualifying US, federal, state, or local government entities, so that could work. Okay, so this is the International Entrepreneur Parole Program. It's often called the startup visa, and it's unfortunately not living up to all the excitement that we had for it. What is parole status? Why is that not considered like a visa? It's just a legal entry into the United States. It's not a visa like the F1 or the H1 or the B or O1. And there's no direct path to permanent residence. Again, what most lawyers encourage folks to do if they're interested in this is, let's look at the O, and especially because the O will get you to the path for a green card based on extraordinary ability. So most lawyers, if you want to talk to them about it, don't be surprised if they're really kind of pushing you towards other visa options. And that's because this visa option has been it's not a visa, first of all, but this option has been very disappointing. So just to give you a little bit about the filing procedures, it's a grant of 2 years with a 5-year maximum. There's an application here. The filing fee is, it's not little, but it's $1,285. And while there's no salary requirement for you as an entrepreneur, you have to show that your household income will be 400% above the poverty guidelines. So what that means is, and I gave you some ideas here, if it's you and one other person in your household, like your spouse, then you would have to show your income is $80,100. Now, one workaround is that your spouse gets work authorization. So if you did apply for this, and if you did get this, you could say, well, my spouse is going to be earning X amount. So that's the household income. So spouses and children can come with you. As I was saying, your spouse may work, can apply for the EAD, and she can study. Okay, couple more. Now, if you want to do this as a joint kind of, co-founder opportunity, and you're all international students, let's say you did your master's at Stanford and you found a few other international students, you can only have 3 entrepreneurs per entity. If it's denied, there's no appeal of the denial, and then it can be taken away at any time if the company stops operating. So these are just some limitations about the IEP. And the reason why they have these limitations, they keep emphasizing them, is because the International Parole Program was something that the Obama administration created, and it wasn't through Congress, which is normally what's required. If you want to create a visa category, Congress has to approve it. But because Congress has not been approving a startup visa, which has been repeatedly proposed to them, the Obama administration came up with this parole program. And so in order to avoid in order to avoid having the program stopped as illegal because Congress didn't create it, they're being very clear that, like, look, there's no appeal of this, there's no visa associated with this. So that's some of the reasons why it also sounds quite strict. Now, again, as I'd said, I'll give you a quick overview of your options for permanent residence. One is employment, and I've talked about the different ways throughout the presentation, right? Like a green card based on being a manager, or a green card based on extraordinary ability. There's also a green card if your employer tests the labor market. So this is for the green card, not the H-1B, not for any of the other visas. But if there's a green card, the employer can test the labor market and say there's no US worker who could fill this position. So those are employment-based routes to the green card. The other primary route is family. This is actually the most green cards are allocated every year to family-based petitions. So not just spouses, children, and parents of US citizens, but spouses of green card holders, children of green card holders, married adult children of US citizens, siblings of US citizens. There's several categories that qualify for a green card. There's an annual limit. They usually involve a lot of, there's a long wait for all of them. But certainly family is a very common way to get a green card to the United States. There's the annual green card lottery. It's called the diversity visa lottery. You have to be of a national that is not overly represented in the United States. So if you're from India or Mexico or Canada, you're not allowed to register in the annual lottery. But if you're from a country like Italy or Angola or South Africa, there's all these countries where there's just not a lot of immigrants in the United States from them. So in order to promote diversity, we have an annual lottery. It's free, it's online. It's just usually in late October to November. It's on, like I said, it's online. And the only issue is that there's 15 million people apply and only 50,000 green cards given. So the chances of getting a green card are small, but I definitely know people who applied, who got it, and who are here living on their green cards. So it does work. And so I encourage you, if you're from a national of a country that could apply, just apply. It doesn't mean that you've expressed immigrant intent. It's fine. I will add you all to my email listserv. You can unsubscribe, but it's easier for me just to add you all. But I announce when this is opening every year. I also announce when the H-1B lottery is happening. So you'll get my updates. And again, when you get that update, you'll know, oh, I better register for this. The fourth common way of getting a green card to the United States is asylum. So this is if you are afraid to return to your home country. You have to be here in order to apply for asylum, and you have to say, I am scared to go back to my home country for a particular reason. And, I've been subject to harm, or I'm at risk of harm. So this is another way. There's a lot of people right now applying from Afghanistan and Ukraine. So the system is extremely backed up right now. This process does take years and years and years. You do get work authorization after a certain amount of time. while you're waiting for your asylum application to be heard. So this is another option. And finally is investment. If you have about $1 million to invest in the United States, and you can invest that and generate 10 jobs. This is a great option. It is not so great for Chinese nationals. There's a long wait for Chinese nationals because they've used up all the allocation for them. There's a smaller wait for Indians, but for the rest, you can apply. And you can, at the same time that you apply for the investment-based green card, you can apply for your actual green card application. I'm getting very technical here, but this is a great option too. And there's regional centers. You can also invest $800,000 in an economically depressed area. So this is your fifth. These are the 5 primary pathways to getting a green card to the United States: investment, asylum, the annual green card lottery, family, and employment. Okay. Let me just close with some common obstacles, and then I want to make sure we have time for questions and answers. I'm sorry, we've been going a little over. As I'd mentioned, the 2-year home residency requirements for the J1s, that is a common obstacle. People don't realize that they're subject to it. And then they go for a visa and they're like, oh my God, I have the 2-year home residency requirement. If you've had previous overstays in the United States where you've stayed longer than you were allowed, we saw a lot of this during COVID. People came, they were given 6-month visas, and then they just stayed because they were afraid to travel. If you didn't apply to extend your visa, if your visitor status, then you're subject to a bar. So you want to be careful that you don't overstay more than you're allowed. Another is if you forget or you don't answer the questions properly on the DS-160, which is the form that you complete to apply for a visa to the United States. And then the government's like, oh, well, you're saying you've never been arrested, but we see after you did your biometrics that you had this arrest or you had that conviction. So if you don't complete those applications truthfully, that can be a problem too. And then of course, speaking of arrests and convictions, if you're in the United States and if you've been arrested or convicted, you should definitely talk to an immigration lawyer before you plead guilty to anything. And also you want to talk to an immigration lawyer about how to present the facts in the future when you apply for a visa, because you always have to say that this has happened. And then the best thing is describing the situation in a way that makes you look like, good, helps you overcome any pushback from the government. Okay, just a couple of things. As I had mentioned earlier in the presentation, I do have a podcast series called Inside Immigration. I have 16 episodes now. My most recent one was on if you're facing layoffs. I've got another one on if you want to become a citizen. I've got ones on the O1, the E, the H1B. I'm releasing one on the J1 visa, like what it takes, what's the process for getting a trainee visa. And I've also have interviews with former immigration judge, former asylum officer, a former Department of Labor attorney, just on their insights on the process. So I hope you find those useful. Here's my team. We're all here, happy to help. Just stay in touch. I've noticed that as I've been on the presentation, I've been getting LinkedIn connections, and I would love to connect with you on LinkedIn. I do post a lot of my immigration updates on there, but certainly my email list, I do send out email alerts on the latest immigration updates there. So you'll be getting them there, and feel free to reach out, stay in touch, and I'm happy to be a resource to you. I'm going to stop the share now so I can access the chat message. Let's see here, and let's take a look. And I'm sorry, and we can certainly go over. I know for those of you who plan to hop off at 10:30, I'll see if I can get through all my questions as quickly as possible. Let's see here. Yeah, so that's, what if the majority of other partners are not American? That's fine, so long as they don't need a visa. So, if they need a visa, they should also be minorities, minority shareholder, that is. But it's fine if they're not American. What are the pros and cons of filing for a national interest waiver or EB before migrating from the country of origin? There's no, the cons are that you'd have to, for the national interest waiver, you have to show that your work is is of national interest to the US. So if you're not here yet, it's going to be less persuasive to say, hey, I'm working in the national interest of the United States. Okay. Now for the employment-based green card, it depends on the category, but I've had a lot of clients apply from overseas and come in as immigrants. If you have a sponsoring employer, they may, just practically speaking, be nervous about having you come in with a green card, because that means you could quit the next day and go work for someone else. So those are the pros and cons. Yes, it's possible to get the recording. Absolutely. And yes, I definitely agree. It's hard to remember it all. There was so much information covered. Do we need to pay ourselves salary from the E2 investment? Great question. Yes, you do. Okay. And what are the costs associated with the L1? I'm sorry, the O1. The legal fees for the government filing fees for the L1 were $960 plus $2,500 for premium processing. For the O1, the costs are $460. That's the government filing fee. And then if you want premium, it's $2,500 again. Insofar as the legal fees, it depends on the complexity of the facts, the timing. For an O1, the general market rates anywhere between, 8 to 10,000. For the L1, it depends. I'd say market rate is anywhere between 5 and 8,000, but it depends on the facts. When a spouse is not allowed to work. Oh, and by the way, I just want to say, you can certainly always find cheaper attorneys. You can also find companies where the person is not an attorney. So you want to be careful about that. It just depends on what you prefer. If you want an attorney doing this for you, you're probably going to have to pay more. And of course, you want to look at how experienced the attorney is. And just also the relationship, right? The attorney is going to be your trusted advisor. So you want to make sure that, that you're also factoring the cost of that relationship in the legal fees, right? I have a funny quote about Taylor Swift. Someone was asking her, what's her one advice to aspiring musicians? And she said, get a good lawyer. So, you want to make sure you have someone who's, really good advocate on your side. When a spouse is not allowed to work, can a spouse engage in self-employment activity such as exporting cars for profit? That's a gray zone. They're not supposed to be working, but that doesn't mean they can't be productive. There are very conservative lawyers who will tell you, nope, they can't do anything. I am not one of those. I don't agree that they can't do anything. I think that they can certainly keep themselves busy. They can be productive. Exporting cars for profit. We just have to look at the facts, but certainly I know, spouses who are doing graphic design, or they are making clothes, so to me, that's great. They're being productive and they're also making a little money on the side. What is the difference between the O1 and the O2 visa? One is for, I think you're probably thinking, one is for the arts. Well, O1A is so the O2 is for people who are coming to support folks in the O1, who are coming to support artists in the O1 category. Okay, I have a company in the US and I want to come down to attend events, seminars to create business opportunities for my company. Yep, that's great. And so what visa should I apply? I heard that due to COVID, After Effects business visit visas are on hold. So I think what you're meaning to say is that getting an appointment for a visitor visa is very backed up. And you're absolutely right about that. In certain countries like India, to get an appointment for a visitor visa is about a year. You know, one thing you could try is getting that visitor visa in another country. You could contact a country where you don't need a visa to go in as an Indian national, and you could try and get that visitor visa in another country, and you can explain, look, the consulates in India are really backed up for a visitor visa. I really need this visitor visa because I have a company in the US. And so would you please accept my application? And that is possible. Everyone knows that Mission India is horrible in the processing times right now. Okay, on the H-1B visa, how can I prove work experience? Letters from your previous employers. So if you're working with an evaluation agency, they'll give you sort of a format. If you're working with a lawyer, we'll help you come up with that format for how they will describe your work experience so that it goes towards showing you got the equivalent of a university degree studies. I'm on an F1 visa studying for a PhD on computer engineering. Wow, that's impressive. And I have a startup incubated at the USF Student Innovation Incubator. Which is the best option for me? I'm not sure I understand that question because you're already here on an F1 visa. If you're saying you want to work for your incubator, you know, you're going to get OPT and then STEM OPT. So you've got 3 years of work authorization after your PhD. You could even start working saying that you've gotten a master's and then get that OPT and OPT, STEM OPT. So those are probably your best options right now. How is possible to be sure about the company which apply for H-1B, which is authorized or not? I mean, I would look them up online. The company, you know, presumably in giving you an offer, there's a relationship established with them, that they're trustworthy. You can also look up companies on a website, and I can tell you this, I'll put it in chat. Let me just make sure it's sent to everyone. And I'll just do this. It's called Dun and Bradstreet. So if you go in there, look up company profile. Okay. Let's see here. E2 investment. This will erode all the investment and result of payment on taxes that is not actually earned. Is this correct? Well, I mean, that's one way to look at it. I mean, you have to pay yourself a salary. So, and you have to pay taxes on income that is not actually earned. Well, if you're an investor overseeing the investment, you have to pay yourself a salary. So you can look at it as it's eroding the investment and resulting in payment of taxes on income. But from the US government's perspective, if you are doing work on your E2 investment and it's a real business, you should be paid for it. Now, you don't have to pay yourself a lot. I definitely have clients who are just paying themselves like 50 or 60,000 as a salary for overseeing their investment. So it's not a lot that you have to pay yourself. How would a potential salary work for a person who has a F1 visa and is a potentially a student working with CPT, OPT, or STEM OPT? There are no salary requirements for CPT and OPT. You can even work unpaid. On the STEM OPT, you have to be working be paid a reasonable salary. So it's not like the prevailing wage requirements for the H-1B. I'm on an H-1B visa. Can I convert to O-1? Yeah, if you qualify, we can apply to change your status to O-1. Is there a link or website which is ready to offer H-1B visas? I'm not sure I understand that question. So is that, are you asking if how do you know if a company is willing to offer H-1B visas? There is a website called Visa Door, and there you can look up a company that has sponsored people for H-1Bs, and also what roles and how much the salaries are. So you can definitely look online for that. Okay, hello, I have been working in robotics for several years. I have some awards and work in artificial intelligence. However, I am self-taught, but I have a portfolio of work done. Can I apply for the O-1 visa with this? Yeah, you can. Yeah, you don't need a degree for the O-1, but you definitely need to show you're an expert in your field. Okay, yeah, if you will all be added to my email. I will send an email out to everyone who's been in this presentation. I will send the slides and we will share the recording as well. Absolutely. Can an H1 person get money from a Play Store app for the app developed? Yeah, you can, so long as if you are here to work, if you are continuing to work for your H-1B, the primary employer who sponsored you, and the app is something you developed in the side and you're earning some money from it, that should be fine. Can a person on H-1B start a company with a US citizen partner? Yes, you can. You just cannot be the majority shareholder. And you of course need to show funding to pay for you and a business plan that this is a real business. Can an F1 visa get converted into an O1 visa? Yes. Any age limit for a person applying for a J1 visa? Well, you have to be a university student or a young professional. And young is not necessarily by age, but by how soon after graduating, how long after graduating have you been working? So if it's got to be under 5 years. So it's not an age limit so much as whether you're in university or how recently you've graduated. Okay, well, it's 10:33. I'm going to stop the recording now, and I want to thank you all so much for these great questions, for attending this presentation. I'll definitely be sharing the recording, the slides, a link to my podcast, and also I have a one-page infographic on the different kinds of employment-based visas. So yeah, please connect with me on LinkedIn, stay in touch. I'd be happy to help. Take care, everyone, and good luck. Oh, and Happy New Year. Bye.